on terrorism, I think I'm just going to be saying very few things because it's a fact of life. Those of you who know what terrorism is, let me refresh your memory. And this is, in my words, a very simple way of saying it. And I want to read it. Systematic use or threatened use of violence to intimidate a population, community, or government, and thereby effect political, religious, or ideological change, and that change is for their own interests. Terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir goes back to the recent one, 1947. We have heard about 7, not simply once, but 7 exodus that Kashmiri Hindus had suffered. But I want to go back only to 1947. Maharaja Hari Singh at that time, when he sent a letter to Lord Mountbatten, and that was October 26, 1947. And that was with the instrument of accession. But I want to cite to you what he said. He said, we need protection. Protection against, and I quote it, soldiers in plain clothes and desperados, both with modern weapons, and it's resulting in what he said, wanton destruction of life and property. So that's the beginning in Jammu and Kashmir of terrorism. Now terrorism has taken another form because those in Pakistan who had been working with Pakistani ISI and the government military, those who are working with them on terrorism, what has happened is that now they are also trafficking in drugs. And what is the purpose of terrorism? Purpose at the present time simply is to see that India is destabilized. You have heard about all these wars, and the military is obsessed in Pakistan that India militarily is strong, economically is strong, politically it's a democracy. Around the world it has got its own visibility as a great power to be and moving in that direction. And military feels obsessed with wanting to fight India, wanting to see that it can be nothing else but subjugated in one fashion or other. And so, what is their policy? Terrorism is the one that, according to them, would bleed India with 1,000 cuts. And so, proxy war and effort in order to see, and then what has happened at the present time is that Pakistan has started not simply those terrorist acts in order to confront India, but also with the policy, jihad, Islam, and at the same time terrorist policies. So that's a combination of all that at the present time is happening. Pakistan thought that because a Muslim majority in Kashmir, and then here I think you know that usually when people talk about Kashmir region, they simply talk about Muslim majority Kashmir. But as you heard today, Kashmir is not simply Muslim majority Kashmir Valley. It's Jammu. Jammu is Hindu. It's Gilgit. It is Ladakh. Ladakh is Buddhist. So it's not simply one part, but it's many parts. And in those parts, at the present time, 45% of Jammu and Kashmir is with India, 35% with Pakistan, and 20% at the present time, Aksai Chan with China. So that is the composition at the present time. What happened in 1947 was that obviously Hari Singh did not initially make up his mind, but then once he did, and he wanted to join India, at that time Pakistan had felt that Kashmir would simply join Pakistan because Muslim majority population. But at that time, you probably know, in Jammu and Kashmir, they were simply saying at that time, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh Ittihad, Naya Kashmir Zindabad. And the thought simply was that Kashmir, being Sufi, and these people have been together for some time, that they would probably not want to join Pakistan, and that is why the use of force, and that is why terrorism actions began. Because at that time, I had several examples here, but I think I'll probably give you only two. And this is Muhammad Maqbool Sherwani. Invaders that were coming asked him, what is the way to Srinagar? And he gave them the wrong, totally wrong kind of track. And the same at that time, Indian forces came in. They were on a wrong track. Finally, they found him and they killed him. Another person, Master Abdul Aziz, a tailor, and at that time there were those invaders raping women, and they were looking at a place where they had several women, and they were going to go after them. And this man said, Quran in his hand, stood there, and he said, you have to go over my dead body to touch any woman. Killed him. And there are many examples of that type at that time. And since then, as you heard today, there is no homegrown terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. And you have heard all those slogans, 19th January especially, and I was looking at them. People's League ka kya pehchan, Fateh, Azadi aur Islam, Kashmir banega Pakistan. And then Islam hamara maqsad hai, Quran hamara dastur hai, jihad hamara rasta hai. Islam is our objective, Quran is our constitution, jihad is our way of life. And at the present time, what has happened is that Pakistan cannot deny anymore after what happened in Uri, what happened in Pulwama, and these are clear-cut examples of those organizations in Pakistan nurtured by ISI, trained by them, given money by them, and then also given all kinds of facilities in order to see that they could go on, because Pakistani army would use then their own guns in order to see that the possibility of their infiltration becomes a reality. So Jaish-e-Muhammad, Lashkar-e-Taba, 2611. And so I think at the present time, there is absolutely no doubt that Pakistan is the hub of terrorism. And I think if you could call Pakistan a Mecca of jihadi terrorism, it would not be out of place. Pakistan has used terrorism as a national policy, an instrument of national policy, and that is what has been going on for all these years. I must mention a couple things that have happened in the recent past. You probably know that 23 European Parliament members were in India. They went to Jammu and Kashmir. They looked all around. And one clear message that they found was that Pakistani terrorism is responsible at the present time for what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir, that schools cannot function, that places cannot operate. And the reason for that is that anyone who wants to be leading a normal life is killed by those militants. And there are plenty of people, these are Muslims, not even Hindus, and more Muslims have been killed in the last several years than Hindus. And that is the kind of setting in which at the present time terrorism is. I know that I need to touch upon human rights. I teach it, and obviously what the Indian government had to do at the present time was all those things, people detained, internet not available, there is a kind of lockout. And then the point simply is that under human rights, you can go back to 1947, and before that, the United Nations and Second World War, and after Second World War, that total brutality that had happened. Because of that, the thought simply was that we would like to see that human rights become a part of the international psychology, international functioning, and the United Nations Charter talked about human rights. But human rights at the present time that we see is the one under the prism of Western ideas. Human right means simply that a government must not use excessive force against its own citizens. And that is where today humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, all these kind of new ideas have come into being. So thought simply is that human rights, mostly Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they look at and they pay attention to a government using excessive force. But at the same time, there are some human rights that are non-derogable. And once a country's own life is at stake, there are issues that call for emergency, then human rights do permit human rights norms that you can have some kind of limitations. They are not absolute. And that is what the government of India did at the time of August 8th, because they said that we are going to be using at that present time kind of law and order in order to make sure that all those jihadis who have made their own mark in Jammu and Kashmir and have created kind of setting in which homegrown terrorism is prevalent, that in order to create a setting in which probably normalcy would come out, they had to use that kind of blocking internet and making all those efforts. But I want to remind you that when we talk about human rights and the issue comes of human rights, look at what they call Azad Kashmir. And you heard about Gilgit and Baltistan. So the point simply is that they have not permitted human rights in their own part of Kashmir that they occupy. You probably know that, but I want to remind you that India has allowed the media free access to its J&K territory until now. Pakistan requires, you need to know, foreign journalists to obtain a military-approved no objection certificate. And China has never allowed the international media into its portion of J&K. What at the present time Indian government has done is, and we'll be hearing about 370 after I finish, but the point simply is that with the present time, change that has taken place is a change under which minorities can be peacefully living in Jammu and Kashmir. It's a change where women have got more rights, LGBT people have more rights, and at the present time, the hope is that in order to suppress this terrorism, I think our general has spoken. I wish I could have given him my time because he was wonderful. But I simply want you to know that at the present time, this terrorism that Pakistan has begun, continuing in the last from 47 on until now. It has reached a stage where at the present time, Indian government had to take these steps in order to make sure that the last 60, 70 years, all that has happened where unfortunately terrorism festered in Jammu and Kashmir, and nothing had been done. So that negligence is taken care of, and I hope that in the future we'll see India prosper, Jammu and Kashmir prosper, and under Prime Minister Modi, I hope that we can have a great rising India. And I want to say to you that we all need to work toward that end. Thank you very much.